Centuries ago, a war was fought, and Regoria was destroyed. But in a last-ditch effort, there was one elf who buried a little bit of magic.
Guarantee anyone will find it.
Let's hope someone does.
And now, one young man
Pops, what is this?
will have to end a war started long before his time.
Can't run!
Can't! His spell has taken hold. This is the last possible chance this world may have.
Echoes of Regoria, now available wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Welcome to the All Things Nintendo podcast. I'm Brian Shea, and this is a weekly podcast to discuss all the biggest news and games from the world of Nintendo. As you are listening to this, I am currently in Europe for work, so I am pre-recording this episode, which means we will not hit any news, but we have a massive topic to tackle today as we will be celebrating 40 years of the Super Mario Bros. Franchise. For this episode, it's just going to be me talking all about arguably the most famous and important series, in particular the first game in that series, to ever grace the video game industry. And it's funny because whenever I go to do an evergreen episode, this is actually the first thing I look at. I have a list of all these milestone anniversaries that I put together every year for Game Informer. And I pull from that whenever there's like a time where I'm going to be traveling or I'm going to be away or just like there's not a whole lot going on. And then I will dip into that list of anniversaries that happen to coincide with whatever the episode is going live. And so I opened that document up to see like, oh, if there's anything going on, like, do I have an excuse to dive deep into an important franchise, an important game? And when I looked at the list, I saw like, oh, Super Mario Maker turns 10 years old this week. That's kind of fun. We could dive into that. And then I looked 2 entries down on that list and saw something else. And that was that the original Super Mario Brothers turns 40 years old in Japan this week, which told me, sorry, Mario Maker, you're a fun game. You were a cool 30th anniversary celebration. But just like when my dad was, his birthday is in August and we always celebrated his birthday. But when my brother was born on his birthday, his day got kind of overwrote. So that's kind of what is happening. Originally, I had like a 2 minutes of thinking I was going to do a Super Mario Maker episode on this week's show before I realized that it was also Super Mario Brothers' birthday and 40 years. That is quite the milestone. So we will be diving into all of that, the making of, the legacy of that first Super Mario Brothers game, all on this episode. Also, I know there are a bunch of rumors. I want to acknowledge this since I won't be around. There were a bunch of rumors that this week we are getting the Nintendo Direct that I feel like I've been speculating every single week is going to happen. There are very strong rumors and leakers saying that it's happening on the 11th. So if that did happen when you're listening to this, I'm sorry that the timing of this was so poor that I was away. But I will tackle all the news out of that next week as we're going to devote this entire episode to Super Mario Brothers. So it's interesting because usually when I'm digging through these old interviews and everything, I find like old articles from like Nintendo Power or Game Pro or old like Famitsu interviews. And I will be using a little bit of that. Also a lot of Iwata Asks conversations and everything. But actually there's a decent amount of my own original reporting taken from the times that I've spoken to people like Shigeru Miyamoto, Takashi Tezuka, and Koji Kondo. And then, some videos that they've put out in celebration of some of the anniversaries in the past. So it should be a fun one. I hope you guys enjoy this as we go down the history of one of the most important video games to ever exist. And before we do that, I just want to remind everyone that they are listening to the All Things Nintendo podcast. This comes to your podcast feed completely free each and every Friday. But if you'd like to support me and allow me to keep on making these episodes every week, you can join the Patreon page for as little as $3 a month. That gets you access to the community Discord, which grants priority access to Q&A episodes. But there are also $5 and $10 tiers that get you access to early and ad-free episodes, plus shout-outs at the end of every show. just go to patreon.com and search All Things Nintendo. It would really help me out and allow me to keep on doing this podcast. All right, so Super Mario Brothers. I don't think there's any way to really overstate the importance of this game. I think that it is pretty inarguably the most important video game to ever exist. And as I mentioned, it was 40 years ago this week that it came out on store shelves. But the story actually starts about 42 years ago in Kyoto, Japan. And this is back in 1983. It was a very, very important year for video games. The Nintendo Famicom had just launched in Japan, but over on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the games industry was really in a rough spot. Industry-wide sales in North America had plummeted. The industry had crashed. The market leader at the time, Atari, had really taken a massive hit. And it really seemed like, things were not going, might not even rebound. Sales had declined for years. They'd reached an all-time low of around just $100 million in 1985. And so, the $100 million is nothing if you look at against today's standards, which, again, 40 years later, it's a much different industry. But thankfully, otherwise we might not be here today, the popularity of the Famicom in Japan had sustained Nintendo enough to not go under or not struggle the way that so many other developers and publishers had in those 2 years. But Nintendo was still going through their own problems, and they were being impacted in different ways than I think a lot of its competitors had. So Nintendo was actually in negotiations with Atari, who I had mentioned was the kind of the leader of the North American video games market. They were working with them to bring the Famicom to the West as the Nintendo Enhanced Video System. So the NEVS was almost the name of that. And obviously Atari, being probably the most impacted in the games industry, caused those talks to fall apart. So Nintendo was thinking all right, well, do we just do it on our own, bring the Famicom to our own? So they started investigating, and it turns out that toy stores actually were not willing to stock the Famicom because they had all written it off as kind of a fad that the country had moved on from. They're like, all right, yeah, video games were kind of cool for those few years that Atari was putting out these games, but nobody really wants these anymore, and it's on to the next toy trend. And so Nintendo, being the brilliant minds that they are, went back and thought, how can we get over to North America? And they rebranded the Famicom as an entertainment system and slapped their brand name on the front of that, giving birth to the Nintendo Entertainment System. So that made companies and stores a lot more willing to stock this console. And Nintendo's business side was actually able to get the 1985 release for the NES in the US, but it was also concerned that it is still a video game. They acknowledged that. And in order to really make an impact, the business side needed the development side to create a game that would just really catch the eyes of consumers, people who had kind of soured on the concept of a video game. So Nintendo looked at this small development team in Kyoto, which is where Nintendo is still based to this day. They had them come together to create a game where you jumped across platforms, and it drew inspiration from the 1983 arcade game called Mario Brothers, and then the 1981 arcade game called Donkey Kong, both of which were designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, who at the time was an early 30s designer and artist. He had joined Nintendo in 1977, and I found an article in the New Yorker, and basically said that Miyamoto was hired because his father had a mutual friend with then Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi. And he was hired on, and his earliest works included art for the Sheriff arcade game. And then he was in charge of development for a game called Radar Scope, which was an arcade title that ended up actually being a huge flop. And Yamauchi and Gunpei Yokoi, who was at the time Nintendo's head engineer, And by the way, Gunpei Yokoi, if you want to understand kind of the full influence of him, go back to the episode. It's in July 26th, 2024, where I talked all about the Game Boy's creation, and you will understand why Gunpei Yokoi is maybe the most underappreciated member in kind of the Mount Rushmore of Nintendo developers. And I think that he really does belong to be mentioned alongside the names like Shigeru Miyamoto and Satoru Iwata. And obviously, if you want to learn about Satoru Iwata, you can go back and listen to my episode on his legacy as well. But getting back to this, Yokoi actually asked Miyamoto to take these unsold Radar Scope arcade cabinets and convert them to a new arcade game. And Miyamoto started kicking around using Popeye characters to depict a game where Bluto, who's like the antagonist of Popeye, kidnapped Popeye's love interest, Olive Oil, and then Popeye had to climb up to save her. But Nintendo couldn't get that license. So Miyamoto took that same idea and applied it to like a kind of a goofy looking ape character. And then he wanted kind of like a laid back, like kind of funny hero character, and then a damsel in distress, kind of mirroring that same concept that he had for the Popeye game. And that gave birth to Donkey Kong. So I found an Iwata Asks from 2009. And here's a quote from Miyamoto. He said, quote, "It was a really lucky break. So next we began to flesh out the idea for a game based on the concept we had come up with. Now, a fun game should always be easy to understand. You should be able to take one look at it and know what you have to do straight away. It should be so well constructed that you can tell at a glance what your goal is. And even if you don't succeed, you'll blame yourself rather than the game. Moreover, the people standing around watching the game have also got to be able to enjoy it. These were the kind of issues I discussed with Yokoi-san." So the main character, who was at the time just named Jumpman, was taken out of this game to star in his own title called Mario Brothers, which was a multiplayer arcade game where you compete to defeat the most enemies. And Miyamoto drew him with a mustache because you could save space by making the mustache conceal the mouth while making him recognizable from a sprite. And Miyamoto also wanted to make his arms a different color from his body, which is why they gave him overalls. And they named him Mario after the Italian-American landlord of Nintendo of America's office, Mario Segali. And there are a lot of differences between Mario Brothers and Super Mario Brothers, but this is the first time that we saw Mario and Luigi together in a game. Plus, it's the first time the series used green pipes, which was an homage to the New York sewer system, which Miyamoto was actually fascinated by because it was just all these interconnected pipes. And the pipes were made green because Miyamoto wanted to make the color palette more vibrant. And then Miyamoto was joined by Takashi Tezuka, who was a newer Nintendo employee. And at the time, Tezuka was mid-20s and a relatively fresh graduate from the Osaka University of Arts. And he joined Nintendo in 1984. And the first game he worked on was Miyamoto's then most recent project called Devil World, which was the first instance where Miyamoto and Tezuka worked together, obviously. But their second game was the game that everybody came to know them for. And, you know, I think that you could argue that the secret sauce for most of Nintendo's early stuff, even through to today, wasn't like a duo of Miyamoto and Tezuka, but rather like a legendary trio, which brought in the final piece of that particular puzzle, another mid-20s graduate of the Osaka University of Arts, Koji Kondo. So he actually studied at the art planning department in Osaka University of Art, but not with an emphasis on music. He did, however, play several instruments as a child and was in a jazz and rock cover band. And he was a big fan of Space Invaders, Donkey Kong, and he loved the sound that you could produce in a video game. So he kind of started experimenting a little bit with like making music in like video game, like chiptune sounds. And he was in his school's like job placement program. And he found a listing through that program for working at Nintendo in the sound department. And he wanted it so bad. He was supposed to apply to a whole bunch of different roles as part of this job placement program, but he only wanted to work at Nintendo making sound for that. So he applied to that role as a music composition and sound programmer. And around that same time, Tezuka joined the team as well. And Kondo's first projects were doing kind of like sound effects and jingles for Punch-Out and Golf. And then he also joined Tezuka and Miyamoto on Devil World. So I've talked to Koji Kondo and Shigeru Miyamoto together in the past, back in 2023. And here's a quote that he gave me. Quote, "Even from the very first time I worked on a Mario game, I realized that we're creating music that elicits real-time interaction, music and sound effects that we didn't see in other media, like movies or TV. I think that from that time, Mr. Miyamoto has continually reminded me that that's what we're doing. And I've been able to really focus on those areas. And it's been something that I've really enjoyed doing for all of that time." So this development team was together, and now they began thinking about what could be seen as innovative enough to really grab the attention of US stores and kind of be promising enough to Nintendo as a business to justify the risks associated with selling these consoles in the West. And the idea Tezuka had was to create a bigger hero who runs through a bright setting with beautiful graphics. And Tezuka suggested the Mario Brothers IP to carry forward based on how successful that arcade game was at the time. And Miyamoto agreed, but he wanted to take that concept to the next level. And the ideas were super ambitious at the time. But Nintendo was adamant that they had this date in 1985, and they wanted the game out by the time holiday shopping season of 85 kicked off.
This show is part of Poderation, the nerdy podcast network. From D&D and video games through to ancient history and books of all genres, we are a group of podcasts all about things you can nerd the heck out about. We are currently looking for new podcasts to join the network. So if you know someone who wants to take their nerdy podcast to the next level, send them to poderation.com to get in touch.
And by February of 1985, the team chose the name Super Mario Brothers due to this idea that they had of a super mushroom, which took the place of like this original concept that they had, where originally they were thinking like Mario and Luigi can float around on clouds and shoot fireballs at coins to collect them. And they decided that pretty early on that wasn't going to work. So they started designing other ideas. And one of the early ideas they had was this super mushroom. So the original Mario Brothers didn't scroll at all, and it really only took place on a single screen. And Miyamoto wanted to bring Tezuka's large characters in the bright environments to a bunch of different environments. So, you know, like above ground, underground, underwater. He wanted to just explore these different biomes. And then he wanted to use a screen scrolling technique that was used pretty much exclusively in shooting and action games at the time. And another game that had actually recently used it was Excitebike, which Miyamoto designed, directed, and produced just before beginning work on Super Mario Brothers. So Miyamoto loved the idea so much that he decided to apply it to this new game, and the team used the Excitebike engine to make it a reality. And that meant that they had to design much bigger levels than they did in the original Mario Brothers. So they felt it would be easier to visualize these stages if they actually drew them out on grid paper instead of using computer tools. And they took these like kind of grid-based graph paper and made them basically like block by block to sketch them out and design these levels. And if you're watching the video version, I'm flashing them up on screen as I talk about this. I actually have from an article that I wrote for Game Informer back in 2015. Wow, it's 10 years ago. We have some examples, some scans of those original graph papers. So you can see some of those if you're watching the video version on either Spotify or YouTube. And once they got the level designs just right on the grid paper, they would take the designers like Miyamoto and Tezuka would take those papers and pass them on over to the programmers who would then input them into the computers. And because it took the programmers so long to get through this process and the designers as well, the team sketched out the kinds of levels they wanted to make out on a whiteboard. And even then, Miyamoto would come to the programmers with edits to the point that Miyamoto says that they scolded him and the rest of the team at times. And, you know, since this was an all new kind of game, Nintendo had to figure out how to teach players how to play this game without explicitly telling them in the game. So Miyamoto wanted to give players hazards and mini puzzles to solve, so they gradually learned rather than being bombarded by text or forcing them to read the manual. So they spelled things out to players in World 1-1, like making the first Goomba you encounter like really difficult to avoid unless you just jump over them. And then the first Super Mushroom, they wanted to make it extremely obvious and difficult to avoid once you hit it out of the block so you could see the effects. And the team decided on mushrooms because there is Japanese folklore where people would kind of eat these magical mushrooms in the forest. And the idea of Mario jumping on enemies came from Nintendo employees kind of challenging the idea that any touching of the enemy would harm the hero. So in a lot of other games, if you touch like an enemy, it would just damage you. And Miyamoto and Tezuka thought it didn't make sense that Mario would get hurt by jumping on a turtle. So they made a system where he could do that and remain unharmed. And this eventually turned into kind of the primary way that Mario would defeat the enemies. And the first level needed an easier enemy to defeat than just the turtles, which they would go on to call them Koopa Troopas. So Nintendo created Goombas. And King Koopa was originally thought out by Miyamoto as an ox, but Tezuka kind of looked at the early sketches and thought that an anthropomorphic turtle was actually a better candidate. And they worked together to arrive at the version of King Koopa that we ended up getting. And Gunpei Yokoi actually suggested to Miyamoto that they change Mario taking damage if he dropped from high enough, so it made it so Mario didn't take fall damage, which Miyamoto actually was resistant to at first. He was like, oh, well, like, if he doesn't take fall damage, then like, what kind of game is this? Like, there's not a whole lot of challenge in that case. But Gunpei Yokoi insisted, and they ended up going with that. And I think it was the right call. And it's funny because we actually did see Mario take fall damage in a few games, most notably 3D games. And I do think that was kind of the right call, starting with Super Mario 64, where if he fell too far, it would kind of make sense in that kind of more fully realized version of Mario to take fall damage. So another part of Super Mario Brothers that's extraordinarily iconic is the soundtrack. And believe it or not, the soundtrack of Super Mario Brothers only has 6 songs, all of which were composed by Koji Kondo. And Kondo also did all of the sound effects. And in this process, Kondo actually leaned into his love of Space Invaders, where kind of the music got more intense as the aliens got closer. So he wanted to focus on creating music that felt integrated into the gameplay. And one example that we see of that is kind of like the music speeding up as you're starting to run out of time, or certain levels, being kind of more fitting for like the castle stages feel a lot more harrowing because of the music. So Kondo wanted to really capture that feeling. The star theme is another example of the music reacting to the action that's happening on the screen. So Kondo really, really leaned on his jazz and rock roots, and took inspiration from a Japanese jazz fusion band called T-Square for the music. And their song Sister Marion was actually a direct inspiration for the very iconic Mario theme. And I'm going to play a small clip here underneath my talking for a little bit so you can hear it. And hopefully I won't be demonetized or taken off Spotify, as was the case for a previous episode. But T-Square would actually go on to influence Mario Kart's soundtrack even more, to the point that members of T-Square have actually played on the soundtracks of Mario Kart 8 and Mario Kart World. Since Kondo was a part of the team from the start of development, which was pretty uncommon at the time, he actually had a good sense for kind of the rhythm of Mario's movement. And he created a soundtrack initially, but he didn't think it really fit. So he actually increased the tempo in the hopes that it would cause the player to propel Mario forward. And the real challenge with the music especially, but also a lot of the graphics and everything, was that the Super Mario Brothers cartridge was only 256 kilobits, which was strict storage limitations, and made it so that there's the famous tidbit of the clouds and the bushes in Super Mario Brothers are the same shape, and sound effects being reused in various ways, like the swimming sound and defeating an enemy sound are the same, or losing your power up and and going into a pipe being the same sound. And then Goombas were also created as a static image that just flips, so it's going back and forth instead of being an animation. So they got really creative with ways of making it so that they could fit this all on this one NES cartridge. And it was actually kind of seen as like a swan song for the NES cartridges at the time, because in Japan, they were getting ready to launch the Famicom Disk System. So the team was so prolific that they actually worked on another game in parallel with Super Mario Brothers. And that game was The Legend of Zelda. So they're working on both of these games at the same time, Super Mario Brothers and The Legend of Zelda, which I think is another game that you could point to and be like, there's no game, I think, that rivals Super Mario Brothers in terms of importance in the industry's history. But if you could choose another one to really make an argument, I would listen to your argument of The Legend of Zelda. I don't think I would agree with you. I think it's probably Super Mario Brothers still is the most important game, but The Legend of Zelda is in the conversation, which that was also created by the likes of Shigeru Miyamoto, Takashi Tezuka, and Koji Kondo. And you can see some crossover ideas between the two, like the fire bars, which appears in both games. And so Super Mario Brothers released in Japan on September 13th, 1985, and came to the US within the next couple of months. And it was immediately super successful in Japan, selling 1.2 million copies in its first month and 5 million copies in its first 2 years. And I mean, it goes without saying, it more than accomplished Nintendo's goal of becoming the killer app in the United States. It sold more than 1 million copies in its first year in the United States and 4 million copies in its first 3 years. And people caught on after that because the numbers skyrocketed to 40 million cartridges sold worldwide by 1994, which made it easily the best-selling video game ever at the time. And today, its sales sit around 58 million copies worldwide, keeping it as the 10th best-selling video game ever. And on top of that, reviews were kind of fewer and further between, but critical reception was also extremely high. Top Score called it a, quote, near-perfect game. Ace called it the best game available in Europe. And Computer and Video Games called it one of the best games money can buy. And Tezuka, I will say, Tezuka is an extremely humble man. I've interviewed him, let's see, I think twice in 2015, once in 2019. I think I've interviewed him 5 times, actually. And back in 2015, one of the first times I interviewed him, I asked him about how he found out about Super Mario Brothers being popular. And he said that he basically just put the game out, was proud of it, didn't realize it was blowing up the way that it was. But then he followed up saying, quote, "Not long after its release, I did have a bit of an impression that people were enjoying Super Mario Brothers. There wasn't any place like the internet for people to exchange information, but I could hear feedback from my friends. I didn't think we did anything groundbreaking, but I definitely felt happy to hear that feedback." So it's just kind of hilarious to me to think of this team putting out this game, probably thinking, yeah, we did a pretty good job, and then going right back to work, having no idea that they just sparked the probably most important revolution in their industry's history. And then, you look 40 years later and people are still talking about this game, still being inspired by this game. So in 1986, an arcade version of Super Mario Brothers called Versus Super Mario Brothers released all across the globe. And it featured several changes to make the game more challenging, including making narrower platforms, fewer power-ups, new levels, and a requirement to get 200 coins instead of just 100 for a 1-up. There's that stereotypical arcade challenge being injected into this game. But also in 1986, less than 1 year after the original release, that same team put out Super Mario Brothers 2, but it only came out in Japan. And the reason is often attributed to it being too hard, which was in fact the primary feedback that Nintendo of America gave Nintendo of Japan when they were testing it out. They told Nintendo that it was actually needlessly frustrating and likely wouldn't sell well outside of Japan. And the other reason, though, which I don't think people talk a lot about, is that it was for the Famicom Disk System, which was what Super Mario Brothers 2 was developed for in Japan. That peripheral never made it to the US. And by the time they converted it to an NES cartridge, they feared that the art style would be too outdated. So they actually decided just not to release Super Mario Brothers 2 in the US, but they wanted to capitalize on it. So they didn't get that version, but Nintendo was still like, we really need to put out a sequel in the West because it was such a smash hit. So they took a side-scrolling platform game called Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic, which featured many of the same developers from Super Mario Brothers, and they converted it to feature the Mario cast for the US audience. And in Japan, it's called Super Mario USA, but in the US, it's simply referred to as Super Mario Brothers 2. So from that game, we did get several things that have carried forward, like Birdo and Shy Guy. That's where they all made their debuts. But largely, that game is considered kind of like the outlier in the NES Mario Brothers catalog. Sorry, I had to get a drink of water there. So in 1988, Super Mario Brothers was combined on the same cartridge as another game that they were pushing called Duck Hunt, and bundled with the NES and the light gun as the action set bundle. And that added millions to Super Mario Brothers sales, and it became the most popular way to buy an NES. So 1990, we would get Super Mario Brothers 3. 1991, we would get Super Mario World. And then in 1993, Nintendo would remake Super Mario Brothers as part of the Super Mario All-Stars bundle for Super Nintendo. So that bundle contained 16-bit remakes of the first 3 Mario games, as well as the first ever official release of Japan's Super Mario Brothers 2, which in that bundle was released under the name Super Mario Brothers: The Lost Levels. And in 1999, Nintendo put out Super Mario Brothers Deluxe for the Game Boy Color, which wasn't really a straight remake, but rather it was a game based on the original Super Mario Brothers with a few new features. And an interesting fact that I found was that Super Mario Brothers has actually appeared on every single Nintendo platform in an official capacity, with the exception of Nintendo 64. And I've said this several times, but it has remained, I would say, inarguably one of the most important video games. I would say the most important video game ever released. So Game Informer has this tradition where we take every 100 issues, we take that number. So in 2001, we did it was the 100th issue. We did the top 100 games of all time. In 2009, it was the 200th issue. So we did the top 200 games of all time. Those were both before my time. And then in 2018, we did the top 300 games of all time. And I'm assuming sometime like 3 years from now, we'll do the top 400 games of all time. It's getting a little unwieldy, though. So in 2001 and 2009, Game Informer ranked it as the second greatest video game of all time, though I think the criteria changed a little bit in 2018 when we did our top 300, because we relied a little bit more on more modern titles that were like good to play today. So it dropped to 66, but still, that's an incredible achievement when you consider how many thousands of games have come out over the years. So that was 2018. And then we also, alongside that, we did a reader poll, and Game Informer readers voted it the 98th greatest game ever. So it really is, I think, impossible to accurately convey the importance of Super Mario Brothers. But, you know, it's gone on to spawn a ton of sequels and spin-offs, and has inspired, I would say, pretty much every platformer or action game, for that matter, in the history of this industry. And, you know, speaking of sequels, every game in the Mario franchise calls back to Super Mario Brothers in a bunch of ways. But the new Super Mario Brothers series in particular was created with the original game in mind. And in 2023, when I interviewed Takashi Tezuka and Super Mario Bros. Wonder director Shiro Mori, Tezuka said, quote, "We'd been working on the new Super Mario Bros. Series based on the idea of recreating the experience of Super Mario Bros., or the original Super Mario Bros., which released in 1985, in a new way. You can think of it as carefully preserving the core gameplay while dressing it up with new elements that enhance it." And to circle back to a game that I kind of took a tiny jab at in the beginning of this episode, I asked why Super Mario Maker was a 2D game to the director of Super Mario Maker, Yosuke Yoshino. And Yosuke Yoshino said, quote, "Tezuka-san felt that 2D would be necessary since the gameplay of Mario in 2D was well understood by a large number of people. He thought it best to go back to basics and make a side-scrolling Mario that fit modern times. Since we want a lot of people to play Mario, we wanted to add to the variation available as much as possible. So I think going back to the roots like this is a net plus for the series." And honestly, it's so cool to see the original concept of the 2D side-scrolling game be approachable and enjoyable, like being carried forward. So, Mario Maker, New Super Mario Brothers, these are all them acknowledging how approachable the original Super Mario Brothers was, and really trying to capture that spirit, to varying degrees of success. I think the new Super Mario Brothers series is fantastic, but it is, I'm a little hot and cold on it at times. And Mario Maker, I think, is one of the coolest games that's ever come out, probably in my adult life. And I love that the legacy of Super Mario Brothers is carried forward through those games. But I think it was kind of even further demonstrated and carried forward nearly a decade after those games in 2023 with Super Mario Bros. Wonder. And I mentioned the director Shiro Mori. He told me that he was actually directly inspired by the themes that he thought were scattered throughout the original Super Mario Brothers. And here's what he told me back in 2023 when I wrote the Super Mario Bros. Wonder cover story for Game Informer. He said, quote, "I believe that the first Super Mario Bros. Game was really a game filled with secrets and mysteries. For example, if you get a mushroom, your body becomes big. And there are also pipes that initially seem to just be obstacles when in turn you can actually go into it and access an underground area. It's really filled with secrets and mysteries." So 2023, we also got the Super Mario Brothers movie, which grossed more than $1 billion at the box office worldwide, and it's set to receive a sequel in 2026. So I asked Tezuka and Miyamoto at different times why they think the Mario franchise has endured and remained so popular for now over 40 years. And I also referenced like Legend of Zelda also is another franchise that has been around for almost 4 decades, and it has just remained so relevant. And here's what they had to say about like why they think that is the case. So Tezuka actually thinks that it's because of how many development team members have stayed at Nintendo and remained kind of involved in the games while bringing up kind of this new class, which I agree with wholeheartedly. Here's what he said. He said, quote, "Many of them have been working on these franchises for a long time. For example, Mr. Eiji Aonuma became a part of the Zelda team at some point and has been there throughout. And for Mario, it's myself. I think something that's very important to the Mario series, of course, is the level design philosophy." And that's something that actually Miyamoto attributes to why Mario is so popular. It's the easy to understand gameplay, which circles back into the level design philosophies. Here's what Miyamoto told me, quote, "It's very intuitive in that when you see a hole in the ground, you know you have to jump over it. When there's a high place, you want to climb it. That's something that they tried to recreate using the controller, and then as they're playing and as they're interacting with what's on screen with their body. It comes to a point where it's almost like an illusion that they're actually doing the actions themselves. When that intuitive and direct connection happens, then people are encouraged to say, quote, I want to try this. I want to go there and I want to challenge this. And then through that, they're rewarded with other gameplay experiences. That feedback it creates, I think that's the kind of gameplay that Mario is. And this is probably why it can be so appealing to so many different people across both ages, but also cultures and countries. So we don't really have to do a Where Are They Now segment, since you know all three of the main people that I talked about today, and they're all still at Nintendo. But let's run down some of the credits that these three would go on to amass in their careers. So Shigeru Miyamoto, what can we really say? So he was the director of The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Bros. 3, Super Mario 64, and the producer of nearly every major Nintendo game of the last 40 years. He was also the creative director of Super Nintendo World amusement parks and worked closely with the creative team on the Super Mario Brothers movie over at Universal. So, that's the very truncated version of that, and we can go super in depth. Takashi Tezuka, director of The Legend of Zelda, director of Super Mario Bros. 3 alongside Miyamoto, Super Mario World, Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which I think is a game that a lot of people point to as one of the greatest games of all time, if not the greatest game of all time. Director of Link's Awakening, director of Yoshi's Island, and a producer on most of Nintendo's major hits. He's also in charge of overseeing the Mario franchise and worked heavily on Super Mario Bros. Wonder and New Super Mario Bros. Koji Kondo, I don't really even know how to highlight all the work he's done since he's been Nintendo's main composer for 40 years. But some of his soundtracks include Super Mario Bros. 2, Super Mario Bros. 3, Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Yoshi's Island, Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. And then over the last 20 years, he's taken a little bit of a back seat because he's not doing like full compositions or full soundtracks, but typically he's overseeing the music and then doing collaborative soundtracks. But still, he's kind of been heavily involved in the soundtracks of Super Mario Bros. Wonder, Super Mario Odyssey, Super Mario Galaxy 2, and The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. And he also actually slipped back into the role of composer of the original Super Mario Brothers when Super Mario Maker 2 came out, because there were some new biomes that had to be included in that because they wanted to have new backdrops for these games you could create with. And because of that, he had to create new songs for these new biomes. So I think there's like an airship theme that he composed in the style of Super Mario Brothers. And there's also a desert biome that he had to create a new song for. So that's really cool that now there's like new Koji Kondo compositions from 10 years ago for Super Mario Brothers. So when I sat down with Shigeru Miyamoto and Koji Kondo together in 2023, I actually asked them about how their collaboration has evolved over the years. And there's a little bit of back and forth here. So I'll try my best to kind of convey who's saying what. So Miyamoto said, quote, "When there's work on the Mario series, I would go to Kondo-san and ask, can you write one track to this? And make requests like that. There's obviously no guidance that I can provide in terms of music to Mr. Kondo, but I am in a position where I can perhaps provide creative guidance to him. And so over the years, what we really talked about is that when we're creating music for games, let's create music that can only be used or only be possible in games. For example, let's make it so this music speeds up when you're running out of time, or when we're making Mario Kart, let's add music or sound effects that you wouldn't really hear in any other racing game. So the idea creation process is the responsibility of the game designer, and likewise, these kinds of creative ideas need to come from the sound designer as well. That's been something I've been kind of encouraging Mr. Kondo to do, but I don't know. Sometimes he doesn't speak up, so," and then he laughs. And then Kondo chimed in very quickly saying, "That's not true." And then Miyamoto finished up by saying, "No, but he's got a career of almost 40 years, so the idea of creating something that is uniquely Nintendo comes naturally to him." So I want to close on this. It's a sense of introspection that I got from Takashi Tezuka in 2015 when I asked him about kind of putting together a strong team to create games like Super Mario Brothers. He said, quote, "It's important when making a development team to put together a team in such a way that it's going to get the best out of everyone who's a part of that team. If you can really get a team inspired or get everyone to be excited about the game that they're working on, then you'll get people to contribute good ideas that aren't necessarily pertaining to their specific discipline. And that's really good." So I think it's safe to say that Super Mario Brothers was really the start of an era, and really kind of, I would say, the start of the modern games industry as we know it today. And like I've said several times over the course of this podcast, I think it's the most important video game to ever exist. And it's available on Nintendo Switch, multiple forms, actually. So you can play the original version on the NES catalog. You can also play the Super Mario All-Stars SNES remakes on the Super Mario All-Stars on SNES catalog. Donkey Kong is available on Nintendo Switch, as is the original Mario Brothers. You can go, I think they're called Arcade Archives, that you can find on the eShop, and you can buy the original Super Mario Brothers. You can also buy, or not the original Super Mario Brothers, the original Mario Brothers, the arcade game that inspired Super Mario Brothers, as well as the original Donkey Kong. So, I hope you really enjoyed this rundown of the history and legacy of Super Mario Brothers. And like I said, we'll catch up on any news that I missed this week on next week's episode. And, the next couple of episodes should be pretty fun. So, hopefully we did get that Nintendo Direct, but if we didn't, and it's next week for whatever reason, then we'll have a timely episode next week. But if not, then I'm sorry that my trip overseas coincided with this, with potentially a Nintendo Direct. But for now, thank you so much to everyone for listening. As you know, my Patreon and the associated Discord server are the best ways to get any questions or comments in. But you can also get in touch with me at brian@allthingsnintendo.com, or hit me up on Blue Sky or Instagram at Brian P. Shea. That is our show for this week. Thank you again for listening. Take care. We'll see you next time. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening to this episode of All Things Nintendo. Before we get out of here, I just want to give a special shout out to the $10 patrons of this podcast. Alex Stadnik, Andy Junkins, Ben Richlin, Carbon Mjolnir, Chaps My Ass, Derek Sigmund, Dusty Beeman, Ian T. Clark, Jason Thompson, Jawar Hello, Johnny Five, Jose Villalobos, KC Radio Man, Cody Gibson, Creeper 207, Paul at Drunk on Mako, Pratable, Rob McCann, Bobby Mac 265, Robert Sosa, Roberto Nieves, Roger Reichart, Russell Sayer, Smithy Poo, and Zachary Pliggy. Thank you so much for your continued support of this show.
Hey there, I'm Hugh from Poderation. If you liked today's episode, why not check out Dice Will Roll, the queerest Pathfinder show on the planet? Join a crew of 4 friends asking you the important questions about RPGs, like, is it cannibalism to eat a polymorph chicken? From getting 4 nat 1 to the roll to standing up to the darkest forces in the multiverse, Dice Will Roll is available wherever you get your podcasts.